A laboratory in Uppsala, Sweden. A geneticist is staring at a spreadsheet. The numbers make sense. The date does not. She runs the calculation again. Same result. She calls a colleague. Same reaction. Silence then. That can't be right. What Dr. Faridah Birsaki's team had just pulled from a 10,000-year-old bone fragment was a divergence date so ancient it didn't fit anywhere on the accepted map of human prehistory. And the living descendants of that bone, tens of millions of them, are walking around today in a region that 4 separate governments are actively fighting over. This is the story of the Kurds, and I promise you, by the end of this video, you will not see that word the same way again. Hit like right now. Because what I'm about to show you is sitting in peer-reviewed journals, and almost nobody has connected these dots before. Let's start with a single burial site, Ganj-Dareh, Kermanshah Province, Western Iran, roughly 9,900 years ago. A woman dies here. She's around 40 years old. She's buried with goat bones, but not wild goat bones, managed ones, domesticated. This woman lived inside what researchers would later confirm as the earliest evidence of deliberate livestock farming anywhere on Earth. She didn't just eat goats, she helped invent the concept of owning them. When scientists extracted DNA from the densest bone in her skull, the part most likely to survive 10 millennia underground, her genome did something unexpected. It is clustered with what geneticists call Caucasus hunter-gatherers, mountain people. And her population's divergence from the Anatolian Neolithic farmers building settlements to the west, between 46,000 and 77,000 years ago. Not centuries, not millennia, tens of thousands of years. These were not related branches of the same tree. These were 2 entirely separate trees that both, independently, arrived at the idea of farming at roughly the same historical moment, from completely different biological starting points. We've always talked about the Fertile Crescent as one event, one revolution, one moment humanity learned to grow food. Ganj-Dareh says that's wrong. It was at least 2 parallel revolutions happening simultaneously in genetically unrelated populations. And the descendants of the Zagros Revolution, that woman's people, are still here. Here's where it gets genuinely strange. Modern Kurds speak an Indo-Iranian language. That language family was carried into the Near East by pastoralists migrating out of the Central Asian steppe roughly 4,000 years ago. Those steppe migrants left a specific genetic marker, haplogroup R1A-Z93. In populations that truly descend from them in large numbers, that marker runs at 65 to 72%. In some Brahmin communities in South Asia, it hits 72%. That is the genetic fingerprint of a population that truly arrived, truly multiplied, and truly reshaped the gene pool around them. In Kurdish men, 6%. 6. For comparison, the same steppe migration left 30 to 40% genetic ancestry in Persian populations immediately to the east. Something in the Zagros Mountains resisted the biological transfer, even while the cultural transfer, the language, went through completely. Dr. Yusuf Lazaridis at Harvard has modeled this in depth. The steppe component in Zagros-derived populations is, in his words, detectable but shallow. So what actually happened? The steppe migrants arrived. They were real. Their burial mounds stretch from Ukraine to Kazakhstan, but in Kurdistan, they came in numbers too small to dominate. They were absorbed, genetically digested. They left a language behind like a fossil pressed into rock, and almost nothing else. The language is the residue of a conquest. The genome is the original document. And those 2 things are telling completely different stories about who the Kurds actually are. Have you ever been told your family came from somewhere, and then found out the story was only half true? Drop that in the comments, because that's exactly what's happening here at a civilizational scale. Before the steppe riders, before Persia, before the concept of an empire even existed in this region, something else held these mountains. The Hurrians. They controlled the Kurdish homeland for over 1,000 years. At their peak, their kingdom, called Mitanni, stretched from the Mediterranean coast to the Tigris River. Egyptian pharaohs entered diplomatic marriages with Hurrian princesses. Hurrian gods entered the Hittite religious pantheon. And on a clay tablet found in modern Syria, dated to approximately 1400 BCE, someone pressed marks into wet clay that scholars would later reconstruct as the oldest piece of notated music in human history. Written in Hurrian, dedicated to a Hurrian goddess. That music has been performed in the modern era. It actually exists as audio. The people who composed it held the Kurdish homeland for over a millennium. And then, around 1200 BCE, during the Bronze Age collapse, when civilizations across the entire Mediterranean simultaneously fell apart, the Hurrian state vanished from the political record. Their language was officially dead by 600 BCE. An immunogenetic study from Complutense University of Madrid mapped HLA markers in Kurds, finding they cluster not with Central Asian or Arab groups, but with Armenians, Sephardic Jews, and Georgians. These groups share a pre-Indo-European Near Eastern substrate that predates modern concepts of Iran, Greece, or Rome. In this peer-reviewed paper, Dr. Antonio Arnaiz Villena explicitly links the Kurdish ancestral group to the Hurrians. This scientific evidence suggests the Hurrians did not vanish. They became the Kurds. So let's lay out what the full genetic picture actually looks like. Modern Kurdish DNA is a 4-layer archaeological cross-section. The deepest layer, Iranian Neolithic farmer ancestry, the Ganj Dareh lineage, 10,000 years old, contributing roughly 31% to the Kurdish genome in Iraq. Second layer, Caucasus hunter-gatherer signal, around 12 to 13%, the mountain strain linking Kurds to Armenians and Georgians. Third, Levantine Neolithic farmer ancestry, approximately 22%. Fourth, Anatolian Neolithic farmer signal, around 20%. On top of that ancient foundation, a steppe component of 12% from the Indo-Iranian migrations that delivered the Kurdish language, and a minor Caucasus Bronze Age signal from the disruptions around 1200 BCE. A 2025 study from the Institute of Archaeogenomics in Budapest compared modern Kurdish DNA directly against ancient individuals buried during the Achaemenid, Parthian, and Sassanid periods, 3 separate empires spanning thousands of years. The genetic distance between a 5th century Sassanid-era individual from the Zagros and a modern Sorani Kurd? Nearly zero. The empires changed. The genome didn't. But here is the crack in the portrait, and it matters. The entire reference model for Zagros Neolithic ancestry rests on fewer than 20 ancient individuals. 20 genomes representing 10,000 years of mountain population history. That is a sample size smaller than a school classroom. Change the reference panel slightly, and the steppe ancestry estimate for Kurds shifts from 6% to as high as 24%, depending on who runs the model. The deep continuity is real. The exact proportions are still contested. And in 2022, a preprint appeared on bioarchive, suggesting the Zagros purity signal was partly an artifact of endogamy. Communities marrying within themselves for so many generations, they appear older than they are. 8 months later, that preprint was quietly withdrawn. No retraction notice, no replacement study, no explanation, just a withdrawal banner still visible on the page. That word, withdrawn, does a lot of work in this story. Here is what is not contested. In 2019, Kurdish cultural organizations submitted formal testimony to the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and they cited genomic continuity as direct evidence of original habitation rights. The DNA we have been discussing in this video was referenced as documentation of prior presence. A genome became a land claim. 38 million people are currently divided across 4 countries: Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Syria, each of which has a political interest in defining where Kurds came from and how long they have been there. Regional powers, Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria, each claim Kurds are merely a derivative of their own populations. However, DNA evidence reveals the opposite. Kurds are the foundational substrate of the region, not a branch. In the mountains near Ganj Dareh, where ancient farmers were buried 10,000 years ago, modern conflicts over land rights persist. While political narratives attempt to redefine them, the genomic record proves these people have never left. The genome has held through every empire and border. Subscribe to see how the next discovery connects to this ancient thread.